Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter's joining me today. Hunter, how are you?
I am so good, Autumn, and I just listened to our movie conversation, and I kind of just wish we were doing another movie review.
Well, we are not. We're discussing a book, and we hope that some of you listening are reading along with us.
That's right. And you put on a pink sweater for our book discussion, a pink cardigan, and so I think it's going to go really well.
Yeah, I think so too.
I'm energized.
I like the book we're reading.
Just looking at you, I'm invigorated. I'm activated. I'm excited.
I think I'm less excited about my sweater, although I'm glad that it's giving you some energy. I'm less excited about my sweater, and I'm pretty excited, though, to talk about this book. I think it's helpful.
This book is really good, and I've been reading through it the last week to get ready for these conversations, and I've just been reminded how helpful Carl Trueman's writing has been on this subject, and so I'm eager to dive into this too.
Well, it's called Strange New World. It is by author Carl Trueman, and we often ask at the outset of these sorts of episodes, why are we discussing this? Also, we're going to be discussing this book over the course of several episodes. And as you listen along, whether you're reading the book or not, we hope you're reading with us. But if questions arise while you're reading or listening, send those to us. Mm-hmm. We will weave some of them into our conversations, and then we set aside a week in the conclusion of these discussions as a Q&R episode. So if you have questions, send them to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org.
In fact, as you and I were talking through how to organize some of these episodes, we said we're not going to try to give detailed summaries of each chapter because we could get bogged down in doing that, and it's really interesting, but we think it would be more helpful to give broad summaries and synthesis of the ideas being presented, and then to dialogue about what it means for us as followers of Christ. And so our listeners' questions, if they're reading along, would be really helpful in us knowing what to dialogue about, because we want to dialogue about the questions that are and the thoughts that are coming to your mind. And so please send us your questions.
Yes. The way we'll break down these discussions is in today's episode, we'll cover chapter 1, so introduction to these discussions in chapter 1. In the following episode, we'll discuss chapters 2 through 4. Then in the third week, chapters 5 through 8, and we'll conclude with a discussion of chapter 9. That's the chapter in which Trueman discusses specifically a Christian response, and then our Q&R episode. So today, we're starting just with chapter 1. It's important foundational information for the rest of these discussions. So that's where we're going to start. But now to that question, why are we discussing this book?
Well, I'm going to lob that one right back to you because this was your idea. And
it was.
If folks didn't like the movie review episode, that was my idea. You can blame me. But if people don't like this book, it's your fault. And because you recommended this and you forced me to read this. And so I'm going to ask you, why are we doing this?
I could employ my own version of turnabout is fair play here because prior to Trueman releasing this book, he wrote a much longer more academic work called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And Strange New World, what we're discussing, is it's in some ways a synthesis of that work. But I'm going to let that lie because I did say that we should read this book.
I made you read the long one, so...
So now I'm making you discuss the shorter one.
That's right.
Well, one of the reasons that I suggested that we read Strange New World is because of the specific topic that he's taking on, our understanding of self in our modern age, our understanding of our own identity, and the types of questions that we ask around that. But there are some ways in which our modern concept of identity is running counter to older assumptions of the nature of reality. And because of that, people are confused. I have found some of the modern notions of identity, particularly around sexuality and gender, to be quite confusing. I receive questions from other people that indicate that they are grappling with those same concerns. And then I've encountered new understandings, or I'm going to use the term new, modern understandings of sexuality and gender at work in a specific way in local institutions, particularly in schools that my kids have attended. So within some DPS schools, and I'm not saying this to imply that everyone who has a child in a public school in Denver would encounter the same, but there were a couple of direct ways. One example is some reading that my oldest was assigned, that all of the ninth graders in a particular public high school were assigned. And the book was one I had particular issue with, but there was sexual content, discussion of sexuality in the book, that the book not only presented in a certain way, but the very fact that a book given to all of the ninth graders had this content in it was something that I thought I, as a parent, should have been notified of. But when I emailed the teacher who had assigned the book and then subsequently an administrator at the school, they didn't see it in the same way at all. And so their assumptions about what was appropriate for ninth graders to engage were very different from mine. And so that was one instance in which I was asking these questions. So what has led them to believe that this is appropriate for all of the ninth graders to read? And why is it that their perspective on me as the parent of a ninth grader is so different? Why is there such a gulf here? And then I've heard other questions that are similar from other people.
I've seen you become more interested in this, and I do think you can trace it to what you've encountered with your kids in school. I've seen that other parents wrestle with it as well. I would probably answer this question, why am I interested in this, by saying Carl Trueman helps us understand what he calls expressive individualism, and what he also calls it as part of the social imaginary, which is a very convoluted way of saying it's just the water we swim in. It's just what we assume to be true. And we'll talk in a minute about what expressive individualism means. But I can think back to when I first started pastoring in Denver, and I would talk to people about what was in the Bible. We just teach what was in the Bible, and I would get these instinctive reactions of like, that's not good. So they would have trouble even considering if it was true, and they would have trouble even asking, do I want to submit to this, and wrestling with it at an idea level, because they just had this gut instinctive reaction. That's just not good. And I can remember our first years at church, we had a young lady involved in our church who had just recently come to faith in a different church in a different city, and then she had moved to Denver, and she found us, and we gotten connected, and she was growing as a disciple, and then she started dating a guy, and they started sleeping together, and then she wanted to move in with him, and I was trying to help her understand why this was not God's design for sex, and was not a great foundation upon which to start a relationship. And we're talking about the Bible together, and I wasn't mad at her because she's a baby Christian, and often baby Christians need discipleship in these areas. And yet when we started looking at what Scripture says about sexuality and our bodies and in marriage, and she just had this gut instinctive, like, that is bad, and that's somehow repressive or restrictive of me, and I'm gonna not be authentic. She would use that term. I'm not gonna be authentic if I don't do this. And then she was gone. She ghosted, and I don't know where she is today, but as far as I know, she was just decided to quit following Jesus. And that happens quite a bit. And so I was like, how does that happen? And years later, I started to learn about what sociologists call expressive individualism. I actually read a book that is referenced several times in this book called Habits of the Heart. And the subtitle is Individualism and Commitment in American Life, I believe, by Robert Bellah, and a cohort of sociologists from Cal Berkeley. It was originally published in the 80s, but he describes this way of thinking, this social imaginary, this water. He describes it really well in the book. It's actually a very readable book. And as I read it, I thought, this is describing what I run into over and over again as a pastor. And finally, I had language to explain what I was seeing and noticing and experiencing. And as I started to reflect more intelligently on expressive individualism, I became strongly convinced that it is probably the prevailing way that modern people, including myself, have just been conditioned to look at life, and that you can't squeeze Christianity into it. At some point, Christianity just can't be fit into the mold of expressive individualism, and there's gonna be a choice that we have to make of whether we're going to live that story or we're going to follow Christ. And if we live the expressive individualist story to its logical conclusion, we are not going to be disciples of the original Jesus. And so there's a real choice to be made. And I could start to see that as I study this. This book, I think, helps normal people understand where this came from and why it's such a powerful and pervasive way of thinking in our world.
And together we want to go through a sort of process like the one that you just described, that you went through. If this is the water we swim in, sometimes it's hard to notice or understand it until a particular issue or a particular belief or a way that is manifest brings it into our perspective or our reality. So we want to take some time by reading this book to notice and understand those narratives that are so powerfully at work and that do cause us to be conditioned a certain way.
And hopefully to get outside of that framework, because the biblical worldview is outside of expressive individualism. And so we have to, in some way, leave our culture in order to inhabit the culture of the Bible. And that's an imaginative process. So we've got to see the narrative very clearly at work in our culture, learn to raise the little flag in our heads when we see it at work, and then to get outside of it and to get into the biblical narrative, which I would argue is bigger, better, truer, more life-giving, but counterintuitive, and so might require us to work through some initial resistance to it.
As we get into the first chapter of the book, I want to ask one question to you first, H, because the title of the book is Strange New World. I think that's how we experience some of these powerful ideologies at work, is that they are new. But in a sense, even though that's the title of the book, some of what he's saying is that these ideologies and the way that they've shaped us aren't entirely new.
Yeah, he's going to show how this ideology developed over a couple of hundred years. And so if you take a 200-year perspective, it's not new. It's modern life. And America as a country, as a nation, our development as a nation has kind of paralleled the development of these ideas. And so in the history of our nation even, not new. But if you step further back and go in the history of humanity, they're actually very new, because humanity is far more than 200 to 300 years old. And so they're actually very new in the history of humanity. So I think that's one way in which it's new. But he's also going to argue that we've seen a lot of, almost hit a tipping point in the last 30, 40 years. Mm-hmm. And so he'll give an example at the beginning of chapter 2, which I think we'll talk about next week. But he'll give this example. He quotes the sentence, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body." And then he says, "That would have been nonsense to my grandfather. My grandfather wouldn't even know what to make of that sentence. But even if we disagree with that, we can still know what someone means. Like you and I would know what someone means if they say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body." We know how they got there. We can understand what's kind of going on within them. In some ways, even if we disagree, that is not a out of the left field statement in the culture we live in. And he's saying, but in my grandfather's world, that would have been like, what you talking about, Willis? Like out of left field. And so even in 40 years, we've seen a pretty dramatic tipping point happen in terms of how much this ideology has taken hold of our cultural imagination.
It's so helpful to think about the fact that we would, in a way, understand that statement. I think in terms of the questions, maybe that I'm asking or that I hear people ask, there's this underlying question that says, how did we get here? That's actually what he's answering in the book. In chapter 1, he defines a number of terms that when we understand those definitions, then we can understand how he begins to answer that question. How did we get here? And the first of those is the self.
Yeah, let me read a quote from page 21 if folks have a copy of the book in front of them. He says, when I use the term self in this book, I am referring not to this common sense way of using the term, meaning like that I am somebody. Like I know I'm Hunter and I know that you're Autumn and I know that you wear pink cardigans and I don't. Like that's self. He goes, when I use this term self, I'm referring not to this common sense way of using the term, but rather to the deeper notion of where the real me is to be found, how that shapes my view of life, and in what the fulfillment or happiness of the real me consists. So there's this sense we all have that there's a real me or an authentic me, and he's saying the modern notion of self says that comes from a certain place. This real me comes from a certain place. And he goes on to say, the modern self assumes the authority of inner feelings and sees authenticity as defined by the ability to give social expression to the same, that is, to those inner feelings. The modern self also assumes that society at large will recognize and affirm this behavior. Such a self is defined by what is called expressive individualism. So when he talks about the self, he means the authentic me is who I believe I am or feel that I am in the inner me. And my job is to discover that by looking within me and then to express it, to live it out. And then the world's job is to say, that is you are being authentic.
At the conclusion of one of the quotes that you read, the sentence goes, such a self is defined by what is called expressive individualism. And that's actually the next term that he defines for us.
Okay, that term was defined in that book, Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life by Robert Bellah and all, who the sociologist at Cal Berkeley who wrote that. So he credits Bellah for that. He says the term expressive individualism was coined by the American scholar Robert Bellah, who defines it as follows. Expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized. In short, the modern self is one where authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly in accordance with one's inner feelings.
This is the term that you used a little bit earlier in our conversation, Hunter, this idea of expressive individualism, and that when this assumption is at work, we all are attuned to it. We are conditioned to it in some way. You also mentioned that when you understood this through reading Habits of the Heart and you started to pay attention to it in our local context, you started to see this assumption at work everywhere. So what are ways that we might see people operating on the assumption that the self is defined by who someone believes themselves to be, having gone through this process of discovery, self-discovery, and then now are taking steps to express it?
Let me summarize the examples that they give in the book, Habits of the Heart. The way they conducted their research was they interviewed people, as sociologists do. They studied real people, and some of these people they described in their work. They gave an example of one guy named Brian in that book, and Brian had been previously married and been very career and success driven, and that had his working hard and ignoring his family had destroyed his marriage, and he got divorced, and he had started over. And when he started over, he decided to live a more balanced life, and he had remarried, and he would say, I'm doing better. I'm living a more balanced life. This is more authentic. This is more intuitive. And so we would all look at that and go, yeah, that's good for Brian, But what Bella said is when you ask Brian why this is better, when you ask him why this new life is better than the old life, what he keeps coming back to is, well, I just sense that it is. It just is more authentically me. In other words, he just has an intuition that it is, but he can't refer to anything outside of himself that tells him why it's better. So Brian is not saying, well, because God created man to work, but he also created man to be married. And so I'm working in God's creation, but I'm also having a good marriage. And so when I'm living in the balance and the harmony with which God made me to live, then that's why it's better. He doesn't have those categories. He just has this inward sense of, well, this is just better. And so what they notice over and over and over again in lots of examples is people will strongly feel like they are living their best life or being their authentic self, or they're doing well, or they're doing what is right, but they can't reference anything outside of their own intuition to tell them why that's good or why that's right. That's what he means by expressive individualism. So the authority by which you validate that this is good or this is me is me. It is just an intuition. It's a gut. It's an instinct. And that's what he says is he wrote this book. The first version of it, I think, was written in the 80s, maybe in the 70s. And they updated the research several times, but they project that if this continues, it's going to be very destabilizing to social order because people can't agree on what is good and true. And essentially, they were prophetic because as it unfolded in the next 30, 40 years, it really did create a lot of social instability.
And that's what we feel now. I think that that's one of the reasons that we're having conversations like this. It's because it has brought about a degree of social instability that we sense, that we experience in various ways in our lives. And so it has become now present in our reality. That example is so helpful, and it's intriguing to think about the ways that we do the same, that we actually just ascribe to self as the final authority.
And we don't do that necessarily philosophically or consciously. We do it instinctively. We just navigate according to our gut, and we sense what is right and we sense what is wrong, and we validate our choices based on our own just kind of inner intuition of what is the real me. And we are so hardwired to do that when I read those examples, I was like, oh, I've done that so many times.
Yeah, this is where I think Truman points this out in the book too, and it stuck with me because this is what we do. This assumption of someone's personal sort of lifestyle choice being theirs, and then not having necessarily further implications for society beyond that.
I'm thinking back to an episode we did maybe a couple of years ago on Glennon Doyle Melton, like a lifestyle influencer, and we read an article, I think in the New Yorker about her, a feature article in the New Yorker, and she went through a dramatic shift that she would say her life is better now because of going through this divorce, and then she married a woman instead of being married to a man previously, and this is better and more authentic. And she just typifies exactly in that the same thing that the examples that inhabits the heart gave, and which is she doesn't reference anything outside of her to validate those choices as being authentic and real. She just has a sense that they are. And this was from someone who had at one point in her life professed to be a Christian. And it just shows how the power of this way of thinking is so strong that even if we're professing faith or even if we're reading the Bible, we can just try to squeeze it all into this mold where it doesn't have the lordship of Christ, transformative authority that it's supposed to have in our lives.
Truman in this chapter is saying that this modern concept of the self and then the way expressive individualism works is at work, that this creates these assumptions by which we intuit what is right or wrong. We intuit that we are our highest final authority, that those are the preconditions then for the way in which we see sexuality and gender being expressed in our modern society. And so in chapter 1, the next term that he defines or explains is the sexual revolution.
I think it's important to understand why he talks about the sexual revolution and what he means. One of the hangups that some people might have when they read this book and is to think this is just a book about sex, or it is why are Christians so get so hung up on sex. But the argument he's making is that what he calls the sexual revolution is the most dramatic expression of this larger ideology or intuition that is at work in our culture. So this is what he says on page 25. He said, in short, the sexual revolution does not simply represent a growth in the routine transgression of traditional sexual codes or even a modest expansion of the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable sexual behavior. Right there, he's saying we lived in a time in our nation's history when monogamous marriage was considered to be the right and the best, the proper expression of sexuality. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean people didn't do things but have sex outside of marriage, but it was considered kind of taboo. Mm-hmm. And over time, it's become less taboo to have multiple kinds of sexual relationships. And it's become less and less taboo. And really, that's accelerated since the 1960s. But he doesn't just mean that. He doesn't just mean that, okay, some things are not taboo today that were taboo 100 years ago. That's not what he means by sexual revolution. He says, rather, the sexual revolution is the repudiation of the very idea of such codes in their entirety. More than that, it has come in certain areas, such as that of homosexuality and transgenderism, to require the positive repudiation of traditional sexual mores to the point where belief in or maintenance of such views has come to be seen as ridiculous or even a sign of serious mental or moral deficiency. So, again, what he's saying is it's not just that certain things are okay or considered okay or acceptable today that were not considered acceptable years ago, but also that if you hold these traditional views, there's something now wrong with you just for holding that view. You clearly have a moral deficiency in you for holding those traditional views. You are a bigot or you are narrow-minded or there's something wrong with you. And he says to understand this, we need to see the sexual revolution as a particularly sharp manifestation of the characteristics of expressive individualism. So that's why he's focusing on it, because he sees it as a particularly sharp manifestation of a bigger story. And then he says, if the individual's inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out on that desire in order to be an authentic person. And that's what he's going to explain how we got there in the rest of the book.
One way I see this play out is that sometimes I hear parents express the difficulty of discussing modesty with their teenagers. And typically this is true of parents of teenage girls, but it can apply to girls or boys. And the reason they find it so difficult, the reason parents find this so difficult, is that within a current high school context, the framework by which modesty would have been understood has been done away with. So there is no framework in their social context that even gives them the idea that the way that they clothe their body impacts others. Nothing in their framework tells them that. So introducing this discussion of modesty seems alien to them because the very more that it was founded on is nowhere present in their social context.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a similar theme in some of the Christian debate about purity culture. You see it sometimes when people are talking about the so-called Billy Graham rule, where Billy Graham had this rule he lived by where he wouldn't be alone with a woman who wasn't his wife. And purity culture, the Billy Graham rule, is often dismissed as antiquated. And I think women have raised some legitimate concerns about how that was isolating for them in the workplace, or how it wouldn't give them access to social places that men got easy access to. So I'm not invalidating that that legitimate debate. But I also find it fascinating that we find it hard to even imagine why people would have pursued that. And I think part of that is that we've partly bought into this idea that modesty is ancient, and even to hold that view somehow makes you a dinosaur.
Yep.
There's something wrong with you.
Modesty is a result of a patriarchal society, and so therefore the principles by which it was exercised are thought to be irrelevant.
That's right. And so we couldn't get to this total rejection of modesty as a valid concept without inhabiting this social imaginary he's describing here that's been shaped by that. And I think we have to be honest about that, and we need some self-reflection about that.
There's one last term that you just used, actually, Hunter, that I want to mention because it's at work through the rest of the book as well. And that's this term, social imaginary.
A clumsy term.
Yeah, you already said it's a little bit clumsy.
Well, he said it was a clumsy term in the book. He says it uses the term imaginary, an adjective, as if it's a noun. And this term is attributed to Charles Taylor. But what does he mean by that? I think he just means like the social imaginary is how we intuitively just think about life and think about the world. It is the water that we fish swim in. And it's often said a fish doesn't know that he's wet. And in the same way, the social imaginary is just instinctive to us in a way that we don't even see it as water that we're swimming in. We don't feel it. It just is there. And he's trying to help us see the water we swim in and to do some self-reflection on it.
Yep. He's saying we don't so much think about the water we swim in as we just do, and then we intuitively relate to it. So if we take a moment, though, to apply that understanding to these concepts in the chapter, we could summarize it like we probably have an idea of the self that is similar to the idea of the modern self he described. And we probably buy into this notion that having discovered yourself, then you should take steps to express yourself. That sometimes that directly involves the way you express your sexuality, and that's part of the fruit of the sexual revolution in the way that he described it specifically in the chapter. So that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion for chapter 1. In next week's episode, when we discuss chapters 2 through 4, we'll actually start to answer the question, okay, so how did we get here, where we are today? That's when he starts to unpack a look back so that we can understand our present moment. Well, Hunter, thanks for taking this on with me.
Yeah,
agreeing
thanks for bringing it up.
Discuss it with me. And we hope that those of you listening are tracking along. And as we said at the beginning of the episode, send us your questions. You can send questions, suggestions, comments about cardigans to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.